The frost lay thick across the lawns of Thornfield House that December morning. Each blade of grass crystallized beneath a sky the color of pewter. Inside the grand estate, fires burned in every hearth, yet the corridors retained their ancient chill, a coldness that seemed to emanate not from the stone itself, but from something far more intractable. Sebastian Rothwell, Duke of Thornfield, stood before the windows of his study, one hand resting against the frame, watching the gardens below with an expression that revealed nothing. He was 32 years of age, tall and austere in bearing, with dark hair swept back from a face that had been called handsome in his youth, but had since hardened into something more formidable. Women had pursued him relentlessly through every season in London. He had evaded them all with equal skill. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. The Duke of Thornfield was not cruel. Cruelty required passion, and Sebastian had trained himself to feel nothing of the sort. He was merely distant, reserved, impenetrable. He attended the necessary functions, fulfilled his obligations to his title and estates, and maintained relationships that were correct in every particular, but warm in none. It had been this way for 7 years. Behind him the door opened without ceremony. He did not turn. "Your Grace," came a woman's voice, crisp and efficient. "The household accounts require your signature before the quarter's end." Sebastian remained motionless for a moment longer, then turned slowly. Miss Eleanor Whitmore stood just inside the doorway, a leather-bound ledger balanced in her arms. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple but elegant style that emphasized the fine bones of her face. Her dress was dove-grey wool, well-made but utterly practical, the uniform of a lady who had accepted her circumstances and made peace with them. She had been his estate manager for 18 months. Her father had been a gentleman of modest means who had lost his fortune in an ill-advised investment scheme 3 years prior. The scandal had killed him within the year. Eleanor had been left with nothing save an excellent education and a determination not to become a burden to distant relatives who barely remembered her existence. Sebastian had hired her because she had proven herself competent and because her situation required employment, not charity. She had accepted because she understood the distinction. "Place them on the desk," he said, returning to his position by the window. Eleanor crossed the room with quiet efficiency, the only sound the soft rustle of her skirts against the carpet. She set the ledger down, opened it to the relevant page, and withdrew a pen from the holder on his desk. "The expenditures for the South Wing repairs are listed here," she said, indicating the column with one gloved finger, "and the staff wages for the quarter are itemized below. I've also included a projection for the spring planting based on last year's yields." Sebastian moved to the desk, barely glancing at the figures before taking up the pen. Eleanor's work was always impeccable. He had never found cause to question it. As he signed his name with swift, precise strokes, he was aware of her standing beside the desk, waiting with that particular stillness she possessed. It was a quality he had noticed early in her employment, the ability to be present without demanding attention. Most people filled silence, with nervous chatter or unnecessary movement. Eleanor simply existed within it, as composed as still water. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" she asked when he had finished. Sebastian set down the pen, his gaze falling on her hands, where they rested lightly on the leather cover of the ledger. She wore gloves as she always did during business hours, but he had glimpsed her hands once without them, at church, when she had been arranging flowers for the altar. They had been elegant and capable, moving with a grace that suggested she had once been trained for a very different life than the one she now led. "The tenants in the West Cottages," he said abruptly. "Have they received the additional coal I authorized?" "They have, Your Grace. Mrs. Brennan asked me to convey her gratitude. Her youngest has been ill with a fever, and the warmth has made considerable difference to his recovery." "That is the extent of my concern," Sebastian said, his tone carefully neutral. "That the child recover, not that she should feel gratitude." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested she understood perfectly what he had not said, that he had authorized the coal specifically because he had heard of the child's illness, that his gruffness concealed something he would not acknowledge, even to himself. "Of course, Your Grace," she said quietly. She gathered the ledger and turned to leave. Sebastian watched her go. That odd tightness returning to his chest, the sensation he had begun to notice with increasing frequency whenever she was in his presence. It disturbed him. He had spent 7 years constructing walls around himself, perfecting the art of detachment. Eleanor Whitmore threatened that architecture in ways he could not precisely articulate. "Miss Whitmore," he called just as her hand touched the door handle. She turned, her grey eyes meeting his with that direct, unflappable gaze he found both unsettling and oddly compelling. "Yes, Your Grace." He hesitated, aware that he had called her back without any clear purpose. "The Christmas preparations," he said finally. "You will ensure they are kept modest this year. I have no desire for elaborate festivities." "As you wish," Eleanor said. Then, after the briefest pause, "Though I should mention that the staff have requested permission to hold their traditional Christmas Eve gathering in the servants' hall. It has been their custom for generations." "They may do as they please below stairs," Sebastian said dismissively. "I am referring to the main house." "The main house will remain as you prefer it," Eleanor assured him, quiet and undisturbed. There was no judgment in her tone, no subtle criticism. Yet Sebastian felt the weight of her words nonetheless. Quiet and undisturbed, an accurate description of Thornfield House and of the man who inhabited it. Eleanor inclined her head and departed, leaving Sebastian alone once more, with the frost-covered gardens and his own carefully cultivated isolation. That evening he discovered her in the music room. It was past 9 o'clock, and Sebastian had been making his way to the library when he heard the sound, soft, hesitant piano notes drifting through the partially open door. He paused, one hand on the banister, listening. The melody was simple, almost childlike in its construction, yet played with such careful attention that it transformed into something achingly beautiful. He recognized it after a moment, a folk song, the kind that mothers sang to their children. His own mother had sung it to him a lifetime ago. Sebastian moved toward the doorway, silent on the thick carpet, and looked inside. Eleanor sat at the pianoforte, her back to him, still wearing her grey dress but with her hair slightly loosened from its pins. Her hands moved across the keys with that same grace he had noticed before, each note placed with deliberate tenderness. He should have announced himself, should have turned away and left her to her private moment. Instead, he remained motionless in the doorway, watching the firelight play across her profile as she played. When the song ended, she sat for a long moment with her hands resting on the keys, her head bowed. Then she spoke without turning. "I apologize, Your Grace. I did not realize you were there." Sebastian felt a flicker of something, surprised that she had sensed his presence, and something else he could not name. "I did not give you permission to use the instruments," he said, stepping into the room. Eleanor rose immediately, turning to face him. Her composure was intact, but he saw the faint color in her cheeks. "You are quite right. I overstepped. It will not happen again. Why were you playing?" The question emerged before he could prevent it. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to offer a polite deflection or the truth. "It was my mother's favorite song," she said finally. "She died at Christmas 5 years ago. Sometimes in the evenings I find myself thinking of her." The simple honesty of it struck him with unexpected force. Sebastian had spent 7 years avoiding such admissions, such vulnerability. Yet Eleanor offered it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, to speak of loss, of memory, of the small rituals that sustained one through grief. "You play well," he said, the words emerging more roughly than he intended. "My mother taught me," Eleanor said. "She believed that music was essential to a proper education, even for daughters whose prospects might not include a brilliant match. She said it would sustain me when other things failed." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She was correct, as mothers often are. Sebastian found himself moving closer, drawn by something he did not understand. "You may use the instruments," he said abruptly. "In the evenings, when your duties are complete. There is no reason they should remain silent." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "That is very generous, Your Grace." "It is merely practical," Sebastian countered. "Instruments require regular use to maintain their quality. You would be doing me a service by playing them." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. There was nothing practical about the permission he had just granted. It was pure impulse, the kind of decision that had no place in the carefully ordered existence he had constructed. Eleanor seemed to recognize this as well, for her expression softened into something dangerously close to understanding. "Then I am grateful for the opportunity to be of service," she said gently. They stood there in the firelight, separated by the width of the pianoforte, but connected by something neither of them would acknowledge. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Sebastian knew he should leave, should retreat to his study or his chambers, and restore the proper distance between them. Yet he remained, watching the play of light across Eleanor's face, feeling that tightness in his chest expand into something almost painful. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said finally, forcing himself to turn toward the door. "Good night, Your Grace." He paused at the threshold, then spoke without looking back. "The song your mother favored. Play it whenever you wish." Then he departed before she could respond, before he could do anything else foolish or revealing. But as he climbed the stairs to his chambers, he could still hear the melody in his mind, simple and haunting, a reminder of everything he had spent 7 years trying to forget. In the music room below, Eleanor sat down at the pianoforte once more. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys. She had been employed at Thornfield House for 18 months, and in all that time, the Duke had never spoken to her with such, what? Gentleness? Humanity? She had accepted this position knowing full well the man's reputation. Cold, they said in the village. Distant. A duke who fulfilled his obligations but offered nothing of warmth or kindness beyond the strict requirements of duty. Yet tonight, for a few moments, she had glimpsed something else, something wounded and carefully hidden, something that recognized her own grief because it knew grief intimately. Eleanor drew in a slow breath and began to play again. Not her mother's song this time, but something else, something that expressed what she could not say aloud, that she had noticed him as well, that his rare kindnesses offered in such gruff and awkward fashion had come to mean more to her than they should, that she was, despite every sensible instinct, beginning to care for a man who had locked his heart away so thoroughly that he might never find the key again. The music filled the room, and upstairs in his chambers, Sebastian Rothwell stood at his window, listening to it drift up through the silent house, his hand pressed flat against the cold glass, his jaw tight with the effort of not acknowledging what he felt. It had been 7 years since he had allowed himself to feel anything, 7 years since the night that had taught him the terrible cost of opening his heart. But Eleanor Whitmore, with her quiet competence and her gentle dignity and her hands that moved across piano keys like prayers, was beginning to unmake him, and he did not know whether to be terrified or grateful. The following morning brought a letter. Sebastian sat in his study as dawn broke grey and cold over the estate, the unopened envelope before him on the desk. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Bold, angular strokes that had once written him love letters and promises. Lady Catherine Ashworth, now Lady Catherine Finch, married these past 6 years to an earl with extensive holdings in Derbyshire. He had not heard from her in 7 years, had in fact constructed his entire existence around ensuring he would never need to hear from her again. His hand hovered over the envelope for a long moment before he broke the seal. "Dearest Sebastian, I hope this letter finds you well. I write with news that I felt you should hear directly from me, rather than through the inevitable circulation of London gossip. Thomas and I will be spending Christmas at Blackwood Manor, his estate in Yorkshire. As Blackwood lies but 15 miles from Thornfield, I wondered if you might consider joining us for the Christmas Eve ball we are hosting. It has been too many years since we last spoke, and I believe it past time we addressed what stands between us. I remain, as ever, your devoted friend." Catherine Sebastian read the letter twice, his expression unchanging. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his desk, where it would remain until he decided what, if anything, to do about it. He had loved Catherine once, loved her with the fierce, consuming passion of youth that believes itself immortal. They had grown up on neighboring estates, had known each other since childhood. It had seemed inevitable that they would marry, 2 families of equal rank and fortune, 2 people who understood each other's world perfectly, until the night she had told him, 3 weeks before their wedding, that she could not marry him. "I am sorry, Sebastian," she had said, standing in the garden of her father's house, while the moonlight turned everything silver and cold. "But I have realized that what I feel for you is not love. It is merely familiarity, comfort. Thomas makes me feel alive in a way you never have. Thomas Finch, the Earl of Blackwood, a man 10 years Sebastian's senior, a man of wit and warmth and easy charm, everything Sebastian was not. You gave me your word, Sebastian had said, his voice carefully controlled even as everything inside him shattered. Your family has announced the engagement. The contracts are drawn. I know, Catherine had whispered, tears streaming down her face. And I am a coward for waiting so long to admit the truth, but I cannot marry you, Sebastian. It would be a lie, and you deserve better than that. He had left that garden a different man than he had entered it. The pain had been so acute, so overwhelming, that he had done the only thing he could think to do. He had locked it away, sealed it behind walls of ice and stone and rigid self-control. If he did not feel, he could not be hurt. If he did not love, he could not be betrayed. 7 years. 7 years of perfecting that distance, of becoming the man everyone whispered about in London drawing rooms. The Duke of Thornfield, who attended every necessary function but formed no meaningful attachments, who fulfilled his obligations but offered nothing of himself beyond the strict requirements of duty. And now Catherine wanted to address what stood between them. Sebastian rose from his desk and moved to the window, staring out at the frost-covered grounds. What stood between them was not anger or bitterness. It was the simple, terrible fact that she had taught him never to be vulnerable again. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he said without turning. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion," Eleanor's voice. "But the rector has called with a request regarding the Christmas services." "What request?" "He asks if you might consider providing greenery from the estate for decorating the church. Apparently the usual supplier has fallen ill and—" "Send whatever is needed," Sebastian said curtly. "You need not trouble me with such trivial matters, Miss Whitmore. I trust your judgment in these things." A pause, then quietly, "Of course, Your Grace. I apologize for the disturbance." He heard her begin to withdraw and turned abruptly. "Miss Whitmore." She paused in the doorway, her grey eyes meeting his with that direct, unflappable gaze that had begun to unsettle him so thoroughly. "Forgive my sharp tone," he said, the words emerging with difficulty. "I have received troubling correspondence this morning. My temper is not what it should be." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "There is nothing to forgive, Your Grace. We all have days when the world presses too heavily upon us. Such simple understanding, such quiet acceptance of human frailty." Sebastian found himself taking a step toward her before he caught himself. "The letter I received," he heard himself say, "was from an old acquaintance. She will be nearby for Christmas and has invited me to a ball." Why was he telling her this? It was none of her concern, yet the words continued to emerge, drawn out by that quality of stillness she possessed. "Will you attend?" Eleanor asked. "I do not know," Sebastian admitted. "It has been many years since we last spoke. There are complications." Eleanor regarded him for a long moment, and he had the unsettling sense that she saw far more than he wished to reveal. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the things we avoid most strenuously are the very things we most need to face, though I recognize that is easier said than accomplished. You speak from experience." "I do." A faint, sad smile. "After my father died and the scandal broke, I avoided society entirely for nearly 2 years. I told myself it was because I was in mourning, because the whispers would be unbearable, but the truth was that I was afraid of seeing the pity in people's eyes, afraid of having to acknowledge what had been lost." "And when you finally faced it?" Sebastian asked, drawn despite himself into this unexpected intimacy. "I discovered that the anticipation was worse than the reality," Eleanor said, "that most people are too concerned with their own troubles to dwell overlong on mine, and that avoidance, while protective, is also a kind of prison." Sebastian felt those words settle into him like stones dropped into deep water. A kind of prison. Yes, that was precisely what he had built for himself. "Your counsel is wiser than you know, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I claim no particular wisdom, Your Grace, merely the hard-won knowledge that comes from having made my own share of mistakes." She inclined her head and withdrew, leaving Sebastian alone with his thoughts and the letter that lay hidden in his desk drawer. 3 days passed. 3 days during which Sebastian found himself increasingly aware of Eleanor's presence in the house. He began to notice small things he had previously overlooked. The way she paused to speak kindly to the youngest housemaid, who was new and terrified of making errors. The way she ensured that old Mr. Graves, the head gardener, received extra blankets for his cottage when the temperature dropped sharply. The way she moved through the estate like a gentle current, improving everything she touched without calling attention to her efforts. One afternoon, he came upon her in the conservatory, kneeling beside one of the orange trees that his mother had planted decades ago. The tree had been failing for months, its leaves yellowing and dropping despite the gardener's best efforts. Eleanor was examining the soil carefully, her gloves discarded on the bench beside her, her expression intent with concentration. "Miss Whitmore," Sebastian said from the doorway. She looked up, startled, then rose quickly to her feet. "Your Grace, I apologize. I know this is not strictly within my duties, but I noticed the tree was struggling and thought perhaps you might save it," Sebastian finished. He moved closer, looking down at the tree that had been his mother's particular pride. "The gardeners have tried everything. Sometimes plants fail, not from lack of care, but from too much of it," Eleanor said. "I believe this tree has been overwatered. The roots are sitting in moisture that has nowhere to drain. If we remove some of the soil and replace it with something more porous and reduce the watering schedule, it might recover." Sebastian stared at her, something tightening in his chest. "My mother planted this tree," he said, the words emerging roughly. "The year before she died. I was 10 years old. She made me help her, though I complained about getting my hands dirty." Understanding flickered in Eleanor's eyes. "Then we shall do everything possible to save it," she said simply. "Not I shall save it. We," as though his participation were assumed, as though they were partners in this small act of preservation. "You need—" "Not," Sebastian began. "I would be honored to help, Your Grace," Eleanor interrupted gently, "if you would permit it." He found himself nodding, unable to articulate why this mattered so much, why the thought of working beside her to save this remnant of his mother's legacy felt both terrifying and essential. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said, "after you have completed your usual duties, we shall address it together." Eleanor's smile was small but radiant. "Tomorrow afternoon," she agreed, as she gathered her gloves and departed. Sebastian remained in the conservatory, staring at the failing tree. His mother had been gone for 22 years. Catherine had broken his heart 7 years ago. He had spent all the years between learning to feel nothing, to want nothing, to risk nothing. And yet here he was, looking forward to spending an afternoon repotting a plant with a woman whose very presence threatened every defense he had so carefully constructed. He was beginning to realize that Eleanor Whitmore was dangerous, not because she demanded anything from him, but because she made him want to offer what he had sworn never to give again. The following afternoon, they worked together in companionable silence, their hands moving through soil and roots with careful attention. Eleanor spoke of her mother's garden, of the lessons she had learned about patience and persistence. Sebastian found himself speaking of his own mother, of memories he had buried for decades. "She used to say that gardens teach us about time," he said, his hands dark with earth. "That we plant seeds never knowing if we will live to see the harvest, that we tend things not for our own benefit, but for those who will come after us." "A beautiful philosophy," Eleanor said softly. "I had forgotten it," Sebastian admitted, "until now." Their eyes met over the orange tree, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement. Of what? Neither would say aloud. But as the winter light faded and they cleaned the soil from their hands, Sebastian felt something shift inside him, some small crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 7 years. It terrified him, but he did not turn away. The invitation arrived 1 week before Christmas, Lady Catherine's Christmas Eve ball, engraved on heavy cream paper with elegant script. Sebastian stood in his study holding the card, aware that Eleanor had paused in her delivery of the morning correspondence, waiting for his response. "Shall I send your regrets, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. Sebastian looked up at her, noting the careful neutrality of her expression. "Would you advise me to accept or decline, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor hesitated, clearly surprised by the question. "It is not my place to advise you on such personal matters. Nevertheless, I am asking, She met his gaze directly. "Then I would say that unfinished business has a way of haunting us. Whether you choose to confront it or continue avoiding it, the choice should be made consciously rather than out of fear. And if I choose to confront it, then you go with courage," Eleanor said simply, "and trust that whatever comes of it, you will survive." Sebastian found himself nodding slowly. "I shall accept. Please send word that the Duke of Thornfield will attend Lady Catherine's Christmas Eve ball." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Surprise, concern, but she merely inclined her head. "As you wish, Your Grace. Shall I arrange for your carriage?" "Yes, and Miss Whitmore." She paused at the door. "I would be grateful if you would accompany me." The words emerged before he had fully considered them. Eleanor turned, her eyes widening. "Your Grace, I am your estate manager, not—" "You are a gentlewoman who has suffered misfortune," Sebastian interrupted. "Your father was a gentleman. You were raised for society before circumstances intervened. There is no impropriety in your attendance, and I—" He paused, struggling with the admission. "I would find your presence steadying." Eleanor stood very still, and he could see her weighing the implications. To attend as his companion would fuel speculation, would suggest a connection between them that could not exist. "If you prefer not to," Sebastian said stiffly, "I understand. I shall be honored to accompany you," Eleanor said quietly. "If you are certain." "I am certain," Sebastian said, though he was certain of nothing except that the thought of facing Catherine without Eleanor nearby made something twist painfully in his chest. The days that followed were strange and charged with unspoken tension. Sebastian found himself seeking Eleanor's company with increasing frequency, consulting her on matters that required no consultation, finding excuses to walk past the music room in the evenings when he knew she would be playing. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. She spoke of her father, of the shame and grief that had followed his death. He spoke, haltingly, reluctantly, of his mother, of the loneliness of growing up as a duke's heir with no siblings and a father who valued duty above all else. They never spoke of Catherine directly, but the approaching ball hung between them like a sword suspended on a thread. 3 days before Christmas, Eleanor appeared at his study, wearing a dress Sebastian had never seen before, deep green silk that complemented her auburn hair, clearly from her previous life, preserved carefully for occasions that had ceased to exist. "I thought I should ensure it still fits appropriately," she said, her cheeks faintly flushed, "for the ball." Sebastian rose from his desk, unable to prevent himself from staring. She was beautiful. He had always known she was attractive in an understated way, but in that dress, with her hair arranged more elaborately than usual, she was genuinely striking. "It fits perfectly," he said, his voice emerging rougher than intended. "I have not worn it in 3 years, Eleanor said. "Not since before your world changed," Sebastian finished quietly. "Yes." She smoothed the silk with one hand, a gesture that struck him as both nervous and oddly vulnerable. "It feels strange, like wearing someone else's skin." "You wear it well," Sebastian said. Then, before he could stop himself, "You are beautiful, Miss Whitmore. I trust some gentleman at the ball will be astute enough to recognize it." Eleanor's eyes flew to his, surprise and something else, something warm and dangerously hopeful, flickering in their grey depths. "Your Grace, But whatever she had been about to say was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sebastian's butler entered with a card on a silver tray. "A visitor, Your Grace. Lord Adrian Blackwood. He says he is a cousin to the Earl of Blackwood and has come on a matter of some urgency." Sebastian's jaw tightened. A cousin to Thomas Finch, which meant, inevitably, a connection to Catherine. "Show him in," Sebastian said curtly. Eleanor moved toward the door, but Sebastian spoke before she could leave. "Stay, please. If this concerns the ball, you should hear it." Lord Adrian Blackwood entered with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed anywhere. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired and handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of smile that suggested he found the world generally amusing. "Your Grace," he said, bowing elegantly, "forgive the intrusion. I am staying at Blackwood Manor with my cousin and his wife for the holidays. Lady Catherine asked me to call and confirm your attendance at the ball. She wanted to be certain the invitation reached you safely." It did, Sebastian said coolly, and I have already sent my acceptance. Excellent. Lord Adrian's gaze shifted to Eleanor, his expression brightening with obvious interest. And this must be the companion you mentioned in your reply. I confess, Lady Catherine did not mention you would be bringing such a charming guest. Eleanor stiffened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained perfectly composed. I am Miss Eleanor Whitmore, His Grace's estate manager. It is kind of you to call, Lord Blackwood. Estate manager? Adrian's eyebrows rose, his smile widening. How wonderfully progressive of you, Thornfield. Though I must say, if all estate managers looked like Miss Whitmore, I dare say every gentleman in England would suddenly develop a passionate interest in agricultural reform. The flattery was obvious and well practiced. Sebastian felt something dark and hot unfurl in his chest, an emotion he recognized with dismay as jealousy. Was there anything else, Lord Blackwood? He asked with barely restrained impatience. Actually, yes. Lady Catherine hoped I might persuade you to arrive a day early on Christmas Eve afternoon. There will be a small gathering before the ball, just close friends. She is most eager to speak with you privately before the festivities begin. Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. Of course, Catherine would wish to speak privately, to explain perhaps, to seek forgiveness, or worse, to offer explanations he no longer wished to hear. Tell Lady Catherine I shall arrive at the time appropriate for the ball itself, Sebastian said flatly. Not before. Adrian's smile dimmed slightly, but he inclined his head. As you wish, though I confess I shall be disappointed to miss additional time in Miss Whitmore's company. Perhaps, Miss Whitmore, you might honor me with a dance at the ball. I'm considered tolerably graceful, and I promise not to tread upon your feet more than once or twice. Eleanor's gaze flickered to Sebastian before responding. That is very kind, Lord Blackwood. Perhaps, if the opportunity arises, I shall hold you to that promise. Adrian bowed again, his eyes lingering on Eleanor with unmistakable admiration. Until Christmas Eve, then, Your Grace, Miss Whitmore. When he had departed, silence filled the study like smoke. Sebastian stood rigidly by his desk, aware that his jaw was clenched and his hands were trembling slightly, with an emotion he had no right to feel. He seems pleasant, Eleanor said carefully. He seems like a fool, Sebastian snapped. Eleanor's eyes widened. Your Grace, forgive me. Sebastian turned away, struggling for control. That was ungracious. Lord Blackwood is perfectly pleasant, as you say, but you dislike him. I dislike his presumption. Sebastian forced himself to meet her gaze. His assumption that a few practiced compliments would be sufficient to secure your interest. And if his interest were genuine? Eleanor asked quietly. Would that change your opinion? Sebastian felt the question like a blade between his ribs. You are free to entertain the attentions of whomever you choose, Miss Whitmore. It is not my concern. Is it not? The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor stood very still, her grey eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. No, Sebastian said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. It is not. Something shuddered in Eleanor's expression. She inclined her head formally. Then I shall not trouble you further with such matters, Your Grace. If you will excuse me, I have duties to attend to. She turned to leave, and Sebastian felt panic surge through him. Miss Whitmore. But she was already gone, the door closing softly behind her. Sebastian stood alone in his study, his hands pressed flat against the desk, his breath coming hard. What was he doing? Why had he lied? Why could he not simply tell her the truth, that the thought of Lord Adrian Blackwood or any other man touching her hand, dancing with her, making her smile, filled him with a jealousy so acute it bordered on madness? Because to admit such things would be to admit that he had failed, that 7 years of careful self-protection had crumbled in the face of one quiet, dignified woman with auburn hair and grey eyes and hands that moved across piano keys like prayers, that he was, God's help him, falling in love with Eleanor Whitmore, and love, as Catherine had taught him so thoroughly, was a weakness he could not afford. That evening, Sebastian did not hear music from the music room. He waited in his chambers, listening, but silence filled the house. At midnight, unable to bear it longer, he descended the stairs and stood outside the music room door. The room was dark, the pianoforte closed, and silent. He had wounded her. He knew it as certainly as he knew his own name, and he did not know how to repair what he had broken without tearing down every wall he had spent 7 years constructing. In her own chambers, Eleanor sat at her window, staring out at the frost-covered gardens. She had been foolish to believe that his kindnesses meant anything beyond common decency, foolish to allow her heart to hope. The Duke of Thornfield was not for her. He had loved once. She had seen it. In his face when he mentioned the letter from his old acquaintance. That love had broken him, and he would never risk such pain again. And she would attend the ball as promised. She would maintain her dignity. She would dance with Lord Adrian Blackwood if he asked, and she would smile, and she would pretend that her heart was not breaking for a man too wounded to love again. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, silent and relentless, covering everything in white. Christmas. Eve dawned grey and cold, the world wrapped in snow that had fallen steadily through the night. Sebastian stood in his chambers as his valet assisted him with his formal attire, his mind fixed on the ordeal ahead. He had barely seen Eleanor in the 3 days since Lord Adrian's visit. She had conducted her duties with perfect efficiency, but had avoided any private conversation. The music room remained silent. The easy companionship they had begun to build had fractured, and Sebastian had only himself to blame. At 4 o'clock, his carriage pulled up before the entrance. Eleanor descended the stairs wearing the green silk dress and a velvet cloak, her hair arranged in an elegant style that made her look like the gentlewoman she had been born to be. Her expression was composed, revealing nothing. "Miss Whitmore," Sebastian said, offering his hand to assist her into the carriage. "Your Grace." Her gloved fingers rested briefly in his before she settled herself on the opposite seat, maintaining careful distance. The journey to Blackwood Manor took 40 minutes through snow-covered countryside. They spoke little. Sebastian found himself acutely aware of every detail. The way Eleanor's hands rested folded in her lap, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to emanate from her hair, the way she stared out the window with an expression he could not decipher. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, unable to bear the silence longer. "About what I said the other day, there is nothing to discuss, Your Grace," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You spoke the truth. My personal affairs are not your concern, just as yours are not mine. I apologize if I overstepped propriety." "You overstepped nothing," Sebastian said roughly. I spoke in haste, without consideration." Eleanor turned to look at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest constrict. "You spoke honestly," she said quietly, "which is perhaps all we can ask of each other. I am your employee, Your Grace. Nothing more. I should not have forgotten that." The words struck him with physical force. Nothing more. Was that truly what she believed? What he wished her to believe? Before he could respond, the carriage turned onto the long drive leading to Blackwood Manor. The house rose before them, every window blazing with light, carriages already lined along the drive, disgorging elegantly dressed guests. Sebastian felt his chest tighten with something approaching dread. Catherine was inside that house. Catherine and Thomas and the entire world they inhabited, the world of easy charm and careless affection that had rejected him so thoroughly 7 years ago. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Sebastian descended first, then turned to assist Eleanor. As her hand settled in his, their eyes met. "Whatever happens this evening," he said quietly, the words emerging before he could prevent them, "I am grateful you are here." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or pain. "I shall endeavor to be worthy of that gratitude, Your Grace." They ascended the stairs together, and Sebastian was acutely conscious of her presence beside him. He had brought her here for himself, for his own comfort, without considering what it might cost her. She would face the scrutiny of people who might remember her father's scandal, who would judge her reduced circumstances, and he had given her no protection beyond his name. The thought filled him, with shame even as they were announced. His Grace the Duke of Thornfield and Miss Eleanor Whitmore. The ballroom fell silent for a heartbeat. Then conversations resumed, heads turning, fans fluttering with whispered speculation. Sebastian kept his expression impassive, but he felt Eleanor's hand tremble slightly where it rested on his arm. "Breathe," he murmured. "You are magnificent." Her fingers tightened briefly against his sleeve, Acknowledgement or gratitude he could not say. Then a voice cut through the crowd. Sebastian. Catherine. She moved toward them through the assembled guests, like a ship in full sail, her golden hair elaborately dressed, her gown the deep blue of midnight. She was as beautiful as ever, perhaps more so, with the patina of maturity softening her features. At her side walked Thomas, Earl of Blackwood, his expression genial and warmly welcoming. Sebastian felt his entire body tense. 7 years. 7 years since he had seen her face. 7 years since she had broken his heart with such casual cruelty. "Catherine," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thomas, thank you for the invitation." "We are delighted you came," Thomas said, extending his hand. "It has been far too long, Thornfield." Sebastian shook his hand mechanically, aware of Catherine's gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "And you have brought a guest," Catherine said, her eyes shifting to Eleanor with obvious curiosity. "Miss Whitmore, is it? How delightful." "Lady Catherine," Eleanor said, curtsying with perfect grace. "Lord Blackwood, thank you for including me in your hospitality." "Any friend of Sebastian's is most welcome," Catherine said, though something in her tone suggested the word friend carried implications she found interesting. Before Sebastian could respond, Lord Adrian appeared at Eleanor's elbow, his smile bright and eager. "Miss Whitmore, I am delighted to see you again. Might I claim that dance you promised me?" Eleanor glanced at Sebastian, a question in her eyes. He should say no, should claim the dance himself, establish clearly that she was under his protection. Instead, he heard himself say, "Of course, I am sure Miss Whitmore would be honored." It was a lie. He could see the flash of hurt in Eleanor's eyes before she masked it with a polite smile. "Certainly, Lord Blackwood," she said. "It would be my pleasure." Adrian offered his arm, and Eleanor placed her hand upon it. Sebastian watched them, walked toward the dance floor, jealousy and self-loathing warring in his chest. "Your estate manager," Catherine said softly beside him. "How very unusual." "Miss Whitmore is exceptionally competent," Sebastian said stiffly. "I am sure she is." Catherine's smile was enigmatic. "Come, let us speak privately. There is much I wish to say to you." She turned without waiting for his response, clearly expecting him to follow. Sebastian glanced once more at the dance floor, where Adrian was leading. Eleanor threw the opening movements of a waltz. Her expression was pleasant but distant, and he knew with absolute certainty that she was merely performing. Going through the motions because he had made it clear she meant nothing to him beyond her professional capacity. He had wounded her again, and this time he had no excuse. "Sebastian," Catherine said, pausing at the entrance to a side corridor. He followed her, leaving Eleanor to dance with another man while his heart remained anchored to her like a ship to shore. Catherine led him to a small library off the main corridor, closing the door behind them. The sudden quiet was almost oppressive after the noise of the ballroom. "You look well," she said, turning to face him. "Older, of course, but well." "As do you," Sebastian replied, keeping his tone neutral. Catherine moved closer, her blue eyes searching his face. "Are you happy, Sebastian?" "Truly." The question caught him off guard. "I am content." "That is not the same thing." "Perhaps not, but it is sufficient." Catherine's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "I hurt you terribly. I know that, and I have carried the guilt of it for 7 years. There is nothing to forgive," Sebastian said automatically. "You were honest about your feelings. That required courage." "Honesty delivered too late is cruelty, not courage," Catherine said. "I should have realized sooner, should have ended our engagement before the announcement was made. But I was young and foolish and terrified of disappointing my family." Sebastian said nothing. What was there to say? That her words had shattered him? That he had spent 7 years rebuilding himself into someone who could not be hurt again? That she had taught him never to trust, never to hope, never to love? "I married Thomas," Catherine continued, "and I have been reasonably happy. He is kind and generous, and everything a woman could want in a husband. But sometimes I wonder—" She paused, her gaze distant. "Sometimes I wonder what we might have become, you and I, if I had been braver, if I had chosen duty over passion." "You would have been miserable," Sebastian said flatly. "And so would I." You made the correct choice, Catherine. Did I? She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, roses and something sweeter. Or did I make the coward's choice? The safe choice? Catherine, I saw how you looked at her, Catherine interrupted. You're Miss Whitmore. The way you watched her walk away with Adrian. That look was not indifference, Sebastian. Sebastian's jaw tightened. You know nothing of my feelings. I know you better than you think, Catherine said softly. I know that you have spent 7 years hiding, protecting yourself, becoming the ice duke everyone whispers about in London. But I also know that beneath that ice, there is still the man I once loved, the man who felt deeply, who loved fiercely, who would have moved heaven and earth for the woman he cherished. That man is gone, Sebastian said harshly. Is he? Then why did you bring her here? Why did you look as though someone had driven a knife into your chest when she danced with another man? Sebastian turned away, his hands clenched at his sides. You overreach, Catherine. I overreach because I care about you, Catherine said, moving to stand beside him, because I want you to be happy, and because I recognize the look in your eyes when you watch her. It is the same look you once had when you watch me, but deeper, more real, as though she has reached some part of you I never could. Enough, Sebastian said, the word emerging rough with suppressed emotion. Sebastian, listen to me, Catherine pressed. I am giving you the advice I wish someone had given me 7 years ago. Do not let pride or fear cost you something precious. If you care for her, and I believe you do, then tell her, before it is too late, before you lose her to someone else or to your own. Stubborn refusal to feel anything. I cannot, Sebastian said, the admission tearing from him. I cannot risk it again, Catherine. You do not understand what it cost me, the pain of it. I rebuilt myself from nothing. I will not, subject myself to that again. Then you will live a half-life, Catherine said gently. Safe and isolated and utterly alone. Is that truly what you want? Before Sebastian could answer, the door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with awareness. Forgive the interruption, he said, but I thought you should know, Thornfield. Your Miss Whitmore has stepped out onto the terrace. Lord Adrian followed her. They appeared to be seeking privacy. The word struck Sebastian like a physical blow. Eleanor on the terrace, alone with Adrian, seeking privacy. Without a word, he strode past Thomas and out into the corridor, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to panic. He found the terrace doors and pushed through them into the cold night air. Snow had begun falling again, soft and silent, and there at the balustrade stood Eleanor, with Lord Adrian's hand resting on her arm. Honestly find you quite charming, Adrian was saying, his voice carrying across the quiet. And if you would permit me to call on you at Thornfield— Miss Whitmore, Sebastian said, his voice cutting through the night like steel. Both figures turned. Eleanor's eyes widened. Adrian's expression shifted to one of mild annoyance. Thornfield, Adrian said. We were just— Miss Whitmore is required inside, Sebastian interrupted. Immediately. Eleanor's chin lifted, something defiant flickering in her eyes. Lord Blackwood was being very kind, Your Grace. I do not wish to be rude. Now, Miss Whitmore. Sebastian heard the command in his own voice, the barely controlled desperation, and hated himself for it. Eleanor's expression hardened. She turned to Adrian with a small, apologetic smile. Forgive me. Lord Blackwood, it seems I am being summoned. Of course. Adrian bowed, but his eyes when they met Sebastian's were sharp with challenge. I hope we might continue our conversation later, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor moved toward Sebastian, her skirts whispering against the stone. When she drew level with him, she paused. Was there something you needed, Your Grace? She asked, her voice cold with suppressed anger. I need to speak with you, Sebastian said. Privately. I was speaking privately, Eleanor said, until you interrupted. Miss Whitmore, no. Eleanor's eyes flashed with something he had never seen in them before, fury. No, Your Grace. I will not be ordered about like a servant. You brought me here. You made it clear I mean nothing to you beyond my professional capacity. You handed me over to Lord Blackwood, as though I were nothing. And now you dare to interfere when he shows me the simple courtesy of polite conversation. That was not simple courtesy. Sebastian ground out. He was courting you. And what if he was? Eleanor's voice rose slightly. What possible concern is it of yours? Everything in Sebastian wanted to shout the truth, that she was his concern, that the thought of any man touching her, courting her, taking her away filled him with terror, that he had been a fool, a blind, stubborn, cowardly fool. But the words would not come. The walls he had spent 7 years building held firm, trapping the truth behind ice and stone. You deserve better than a fortune hunter like Lord Adrian, he said instead, his voice harsh. Eleanor stared at him, and he watched her expression shift from anger to something far worse, disappointment. And what do I deserve, Your Grace? She asked quietly. In your estimation? Sebastian opened his mouth, closed it. The answer was there, burning in his chest, but he could not say it. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That is what I thought. She turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving Sebastian alone on the terrace with the snow falling around him and the knowledge that he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. The carriage ride back to Thornfield House was conducted in absolute silence. Eleanor sat across from Sebastian, her face turned toward the window, her posture rigid with carefully controlled emotion. He could see her reflection in the glass, the tightness around her mouth, the way she blinked rapidly as though fighting tears. He had destroyed everything, every fragile connection they had built, every moment of understanding, all of it shattered by his inability to speak the truth. When the carriage finally stopped before Thornfield House, Eleanor descended before the footman could assist her, gathering her skirts and moving swiftly toward the entrance. Sebastian followed, catching up with her in the entrance hall. "Miss Whitmore, please." "I am very tired, Your Grace," Eleanor said without looking at him. "If you will excuse me, I shall retire." "Eleanor." She stopped at the use of her Christian name, her shoulders stiffening. When she turned, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and something else, anger, yes, but also hurt so profound it made his chest ache. "Do not call me that," she said quietly. "You have no right." "I know," Sebastian said, the words emerging roughly. "I know I have no right to anything. But please, Eleanor, allow me to explain." "Explain what, precisely?" Eleanor's voice remained quiet, but he heard the tremor beneath the control. "That you care nothing for me beyond my usefulness as an employee. You have made that abundantly clear, Your Grace. You need not belabor the point. That is not—" Sebastian stepped closer, desperate to make her understand. "That is not what I feel, not remotely." "Then what do you feel?" Eleanor demanded, her composure cracking. "Because I confess myself utterly confused. You seek my company. You confide in me. You ask me to accompany you to a ball and then treat me as though I am an inconvenience. You grow angry when another man shows me kindness, yet you will not. You cannot—" Her voice broke. "Cannot what?" Sebastian asked, his own desperation mounting. "Cannot care for me," Eleanor whispered. "Because of her. Because Lady Catherine broke your heart 7 years ago, and you have spent all the years since ensuring no one could ever hurt you again. I understand that, Your Grace. Truly, I do. But I cannot—" She drew a shaking breath. "I cannot continue as we have been. It is too painful." "What are you saying?" Sebastian felt ice flood his veins. Eleanor met his gaze with eyes full of tears and terrible resolve. "I am saying that when the Christmas season ends, I must leave your employment. I shall provide you with a month's notice, as is proper. That should give you sufficient time to find a replacement." "No." The word emerged as a command, fierce and unequivocal. "No, Eleanor, you cannot—" "I can, and I must," Eleanor said firmly. "I have some savings. I shall go to Bath, where I have a distant cousin who might assist me in finding another position. It is for the best, Your Grace. Surely you must see that." "I see nothing but my own stupidity," Sebastian said harshly. "Eleanor, please, do not make this decision now while we are both overwrought. Give me time to—" "To what?" Eleanor asked. "To become a different man than you are. To suddenly be capable of the vulnerability you have spent years avoiding. I am not so foolish as to believe that possible." She turned toward the stairs, and panic seized Sebastian's throat. "I love you," he said. The words fell into the quiet entrance hall, like stones into still water. Eleanor froze on the bottom step, her back to him. "What did you say?" she whispered. "I love you," Sebastian repeated, the words emerging stronger now that they had been spoken. "I have been falling in love with you since the night I found you playing your mother's song in the music room. Perhaps. Even before that, I have fought it, denied it, built walls against it, but it is the truth nonetheless." Slowly, Eleanor turned to face him. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her expression a mixture of hope and fear that pierced him to his core. "If that is true," she said carefully, "then why have you treated me as you have? Why could you not simply tell me?" "Because I am a coward," Sebastian said, the admission tearing from him. "Because Catherine taught me that love is a weapon that can destroy you. Because I have spent 7 years convincing myself that safety and solitude are preferable to the risk of being hurt again. Because—" He moved toward her, closing the distance between them. "Because I am terrified, Eleanor. Terrified that if I give you my heart, you will realize, as Catherine did, that I am not enough. That I am too cold, too distant, too damaged to be loved." Eleanor's breath caught. "Sebastian, I watched you dance with Lord Adrian," Sebastian continued, the words flowing now that the dam had broken, "and I felt as though someone had driven a blade into my chest. I wanted to cross that ballroom and claim you as mine, to tell every man there that you were not available, not for them, because you belonged to me. But I had no right. I have given you nothing, no declaration, no promise, no reason to believe I could ever be what you deserve." "And what do I deserve?" Eleanor asked, echoing her question from the terrace. "Everything," Sebastian said, simply. "Warmth and laughter and a man who can give you the affection you should have. A man who is not broken by the past." "I do not want a perfect man," Eleanor said, moving down the step toward him. "I want an honest one, a brave one. And what you just said, that took more courage than I believe you realize." Sebastian reached for her hand, then hesitated, uncertain of his welcome. Eleanor closed the remaining distance and placed her palm against his cheek, the gesture achingly tender. "I have been in love with you for months," she said quietly. "Since the day you gave me permission to play the pianoforte, since you helped me save your mother's orange tree, since every small kindness you showed while pretending you felt nothing at all. I saw through your walls, Sebastian. I saw the man beneath the ice, and that is the man I love." Sebastian closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, feeling something inside him crack open. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted. "How to love. Without fear. Without expecting it to end in pain." "Neither do I," Eleanor said. "My father's death taught me that love can bring devastating loss, that trusting can lead to ruin. But I also learned that living in fear is its own kind of death, and I would rather risk the pain than lose the chance for something real." Sebastian opened his eyes, looking into her face with wonder. "You are far braver than I." "Then be brave with me," Eleanor said. "Be imperfect and uncertain and afraid, but be with me." He should say yes, should pull her into his arms and promise her everything, but old habits died hard, and fear still clawed at his throat. "What if I fail you?" he whispered. "What if I cannot become the man you need?" "You already are the man I need," Eleanor said firmly. "Flawed and wounded and stubborn, yes, but also kind and honorable and capable of great love, even if you have forgotten how to show it. I do not ask you to be perfect, Sebastian. I ask only that you try." Sebastian stared at her, this woman who had somehow slipped past every defense he possessed, who saw his worst fears and loved him anyway, who offered him a chance at the very thing he had sworn never to want again. "I will try," he said hoarsely. "God help me, Eleanor, I will try." She smiled then, a real smile, radiant with joy and relief. "That is all I ask." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, feeling her warmth seep into the frozen places inside him. They stood there, in the entrance hall as the clock struck midnight, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "Do not leave," Sebastian murmured against her hair. "Do not go to Bath. Stay with me. Let me prove that I can be worthy of you." "You are already worthy," Eleanor said, her arms tightening around him. "But yes, I shall stay." The following morning, Sebastian woke to weak winter sunlight streaming through his windows and the realization that everything had changed. He descended to breakfast, to find Eleanor already there, reviewing the household accounts as she always did, But when she looked up and smiled at him, a private, intimate smile that spoke of shared secrets and new understanding, he felt his heart stutter in his chest. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Eleanor," he corrected gently. "When we are private, you must call me Sebastian." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Sebastian," she said, testing the name. "Good morning." He moved to her side, unable to stop himself from reaching for her hand. She allowed it, her fingers curling around his with trust that humbled him. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what comes next, about how we might proceed." Eleanor set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "As have I." "I know I said I love you," Sebastian continued, "and that is true, more true than anything I have ever said, but I also know that words alone are insufficient. I must prove my feelings through action, through change." "What kind of change?" Eleanor asked. "I want to be less isolated," Sebastian said, "less cold. I want to open Thornfield House to guests again, to light, to life. I want to—" He paused, struggling for the right words. "I want to become the man my mother raised me to be. Before Catherine, before I built these walls." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "That is a beautiful intention, Sebastian. But you must not do it only for me. You must do it because you want it for yourself. I want it for both of us," Sebastian said firmly, "for the life we might build together if you will have me." "I will have you," Eleanor said simply, "in whatever way you can offer yourself." Sebastian drew a breath, then spoke the words he had been rehearsing since dawn. "Then allow me to court you properly. Allow me time to prove that I have changed, that I can be the man you deserve. And when the spring comes, if you are still willing—" He paused, his throat tight. "I would ask you to be my wife." Eleanor's breath caught. "Sebastian, I know it is too soon," he said quickly. "I know I must earn your trust, but I want you to know my intentions. I want there to be no doubt that this is not merely affection or convenience. This is—" He struggled for words adequate to the feeling. "This is the rest of my life if you will have it." Eleanor rose from her chair and moved into his arms, pressing her face against his chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to all of it, to courting and spring and forever. Yes." Sebastian held her, feeling tears prick his own eyes, the first he had shed in 7 years. They were not tears of pain, but of something infinitely more precious: hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the grounds in pristine white. Inside Thornfield House, the Duke, who had kept the world at arm's length for 7 years, held the woman he loved and allowed himself, finally, to feel. It was terrifying. It was painful. It was the most alive he had felt since Catherine had broken his heart in that moonlit garden, and it was worth every moment of fear. January arrived with bitter cold and brilliant sunshine that turned the snow-covered landscape into something from a fairy tale. Sebastian stood at his study window, watching Eleanor in the garden below as she supervised the winter pruning with the head gardener. Even bundled in her heavy cloak, she moved with grace and purpose, and he felt his chest tighten with the now familiar sensation of love. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the ball. 3 weeks during which Sebastian had worked consciously and deliberately to become the man he had promised to be. It was harder than he had anticipated. 7 years of carefully constructed distance could not be dismantled in mere days. He found himself falling back into old patterns, retreating to his study when emotions became too intense, responding with coolness when vulnerability was required. But each time, Eleanor would gently call him back, would wait patiently for him to find the words he needed, would offer understanding without judgment. Slowly, painfully, the walls were coming down. He had begun inviting the tenants to dine at the main house, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He had attended services at the village church and spoken with people beyond the minimal requirements of politeness. He had even, at Eleanor's gentle insistence, written to Catherine, a brief note thanking her for her advice and wishing her well. But there was one thing he had not yet done, one conversation he had been avoiding out of fear and old pride. The knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Eleanor stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of winter air and pine. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes bright. "The orange tree is showing new growth," she said, smiling. "I thought you should know. It appears our efforts were successful." Sebastian moved toward her, taking her cold hands in his and chafing them gently. "You are frozen. Come, sit by the fire." In a moment, Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "First, I need to speak with you about something." Sebastian felt apprehension prickle along his spine. "What is it?" "I received a letter today," Eleanor said carefully, "from my cousin in Bath. She has found me a position, companion to an elderly lady of some means. The salary would be generous, and the lady is known to be kind. My cousin thought I should at least consider it." Ice flooded Sebastian's veins. "And are you considering it?" "That depends," Eleanor said quietly, "on whether you still intend to ask me to be your wife come spring." Sebastian stared at her, shocked by the directness of the question. "Of course I intend it. Eleanor, surely you know—" "I know that you love me," Eleanor interrupted. "I believe that absolutely. But loving someone and marrying them are different things, Sebastian. Marriage would mean bringing me fully into your world, introducing me to society, accepting the whispers about my father's scandal, about my reduced circumstances. It would mean making me your duchess." Sebastian heard the uncertainty beneath her words, and understanding struck him like lightning. She was afraid that when the moment came he would retreat behind his walls again, that his fear of society's judgment would override his love for her. "Come with me," he said abruptly, taking her hand. "Where?" "You will see." He led her through the house and up the stairs to a wing that had been closed off for years, his mother's rooms. Eleanor followed without question, though he felt her fingers tighten around his. The rooms were exactly as they had been the day his mother died 22 years ago. Dusty, yes, but perfectly preserved. Sebastian had never been able to bring himself to change anything. He led Eleanor to his mother's writing desk and opened the top drawer. Inside lay a small velvet box, aged but still beautiful. "My mother's engagement." "Ring," Sebastian said, removing the box and opening it. The ring inside was exquisite, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in gold. "My father gave it to her when he proposed. She wore it every day until she died." Eleanor stared at the ring, her breath catching. "Sebastian—" "I had intended to wait until spring," Sebastian said, "to court you properly, as I promised. But I realize now that waiting is merely another form of fear, another way of protecting myself, and I am done being afraid." He took the ring from the box and held it between them, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. "I am far from perfect, Eleanor Whitmore," he said. "I am cold when I should be warm. I retreat when I should advance. I have spent 7 years hiding from the world and from myself, but you have shown me that isolation is not protection. It is merely a slower form of death. You have given me the courage to feel again, to hope again, to believe that I might be worthy of love." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, allowing him to speak. "I do not care what society thinks," Sebastian continued, his voice gaining strength. "I do not care about the whispers or the scandal or anything except this. You are the finest person I have ever known. You are kind and brave and honorable in ways I can only aspire to, and I would be the most fortunate man alive if you would consent to be my wife." He drew a breath, then spoke the words he had been too afraid to say 3 weeks ago. "Eleanor Whitmore, I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become. Will you marry me? Not in spring when I have somehow proven myself worthy, but now? Will you marry me as I am, flawed and wounded and still learning how to love, and trust that together we will become what we need to be?" Silence filled the dusty room. Eleanor stared at him, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of joy and something that looked almost like pain. "Sebastian," she whispered. "You, foolish, wonderful man, do you not understand? I have never needed you to be perfect. I have only needed you to be honest, to be present, to be willing to try." "Is that a yes?" Sebastian asked, hope and fear warring in his chest. "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, you stubborn, impossible duke. I will marry you. I will marry you today, tomorrow, whenever you wish. I will stand beside you as your duchess and face whatever whispers come, because I love you, Sebastian Rothwell. I love you exactly as you are." Sebastian's hands trembled as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, which she was. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "Thank you for seeing past the ice, for believing in the man beneath, for having the courage I lacked." "We found courage together," Eleanor said, her arms tight around him. "And together we shall face whatever comes." They stood there in his mother's rooms, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, creating something new, something precious, something that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. The following morning, Sebastian sent word to the village rector. They would be married in 3 weeks' time, a small ceremony in the estate chapel, with only the staff and tenants as witnesses. Eleanor had no family to invite, and Sebastian wanted no grand society event. This marriage would be for them, not for show. But first there was one more thing he needed to do. He found Eleanor in the music room that evening, playing the pianoforte as she had begun to do again. The melody was something new, more complex than her mother's folk song, filled with passion and longing. "That is beautiful," Sebastian said from the doorway. Eleanor's hands stilled on the keys. She turned, her expression soft with the love she no longer tried to hide. "Come sit with me," she said, moving to make room on the bench. Sebastian crossed the room and settled beside her. Their shoulders touched, and he felt the warmth of her presence seep into him. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what I said the night of the ball, about not knowing how to love without fear. And," Eleanor prompted gently, "and I have realized something," Sebastian continued. "Fear will always be there, in some measure. The fear of loss, of pain, of inadequacy. But love is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to feel afraid and choose connection anyway." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "That is very wise. I learned it from you," Sebastian said simply. "You chose to love me despite every reason not to, despite my coldness, my walls, my inability to offer you the warmth you deserved. You chose me anyway. Because beneath the ice," Eleanor said, placing her hand over his heart, "there was this, a man capable of profound feeling, a man worth knowing, worth loving." Sebastian covered her hand with his own, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath their joined palms. "I want to tell you about Catherine," he said abruptly, "about what happened 7 years ago. You deserve to know the truth." "You need not," Eleanor began. "I want to," Sebastian interrupted. "I need you to understand why I became what I did, and I need to lay that ghost to rest before we move forward." Eleanor nodded, settling more comfortably against him. "Then tell me." Sebastian drew a breath and began to speak. He told her everything, about growing up with Catherine, about the engagement, about the night she had broken it off. He spoke of the pain that had felt like dying, of the months afterward, when he had walked through the world like an automaton, feeling nothing, wanting nothing. "I convinced myself it was strength," he said quietly. "This distance I cultivated, this refusal to feel, but it was not strength. It was cowardice. I was so afraid of being hurt again that I chose to feel nothing at all, and in doing so I became less than human." "You became self-protective," Eleanor corrected gently. "There is no shame in that. We all find ways to survive our pain." "But I was not merely surviving," Sebastian said. "I was existing. There is a difference, and it took you, your kindness, your quiet persistence, your refusal to accept my walls as immutable, to show me that." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "Catherine did hurt you terribly, but she also did you a favor." Sebastian turned to look at her, surprised. "How so?" "Because if she had married you," Eleanor said, "you would never have been free to find me. We would never have had this, whatever this becomes. And I am selfish enough to be grateful for that." Sebastian felt something inside him ease, the last knot of pain surrounding Catherine's betrayal, loosening and falling away. "I am grateful as well," he said, "more grateful than I can express." They sat together in comfortable silence, the firelight playing across the walls. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice tentative. "May I ask you something?" "Anything," Sebastian said. "When we are married," Eleanor began carefully, "will you truly be able to introduce me to society without shame? To stand beside me when people whisper about my father's scandal? To weather the speculation about my sudden elevation from estate manager to duchess?" Sebastian heard the vulnerability in her question and understood it completely. She had been hurt too, by circumstance, by loss, by the cruel judgments of a world that valued propriety over compassion. "I will stand beside you," he said firmly, "not merely without shame, but with pride. You are not defined by your father's mistakes, Eleanor. You are defined by your own character, which is beyond reproach, and anyone who cannot see that is unworthy of our notice." "But your reputation—" "My reputation," Sebastian interrupted, "is that of a cold, distant man who cares for nothing and no one. That reputation is well earned and thoroughly deserved. If marriage to you causes society to whisper about me, then let them whisper. I shall count it an improvement over their current opinions." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with relief. "You are serious?" "Completely," Sebastian said. "Eleanor, you must understand something. For 7 years I have lived according to other people's expectations. I have been the dutiful duke, the proper aristocrat, the man who fulfills every obligation while giving nothing of himself. I am done with that. I am done caring what society thinks. The only opinion that matters to me now is yours." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her grey eyes searching his. "You truly mean that?" "I do," Sebastian said. "And to prove it, I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" "After we are married," Sebastian said, "I want to host a ball here at Thornfield House, a grand affair, with invitations sent to every family in the county and beyond. I want to introduce you to society properly, not as my estate manager who has somehow ensnared me, but as my wife, my Duchess, the woman I love and have chosen above all others." Eleanor's breath caught. That would be terrifying?" Sebastian supplied with a slight smile. "Yes, for both of us. I have not hosted a ball in 7 years. You have not attended a society function as anything other than a hired companion. We shall both be stepping far outside our comfort, but we shall do it. Together." "Together," Eleanor repeated, her expression softening. "Yes, that is a word I am learning to love." Sebastian leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. "I never believed I would have this," he whispered. "A partner. Someone who sees my worst self and loves me anyway. Someone brave enough to walk beside me rather than behind me." "And I never believed," Eleanor whispered back, "that I would find a man worth risking my heart for. A man whose very wounds make him more beautiful rather than less. A man who struggles so mightily to be good, even when he does not believe himself capable of it." They kissed then, softly at first, then with growing passion. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their eyes bright with emotion. "3 weeks, Sebastian said. 3 weeks until you become my wife. It seems an eternity. Then we shall fill it with preparation," Eleanor said practically. "We have a wedding to plan, a ballroom to refurbish, a life to begin building." "Always so sensible," Sebastian teased gently. "One of us must be," Eleanor returned, smiling. "You are prone to grand romantic gestures that require significant practical logistics." Sebastian laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. It felt strange on his tongue, foreign after so many years of careful restraint, but it also felt right, natural, like coming home after a long journey. "Play for me," he said, gesturing to the pianoforte. "Play something joyful." Eleanor's fingers found the keys, and music filled the room, bright and exuberant, full of hope and promise. Sebastian closed his eyes, listening, feeling the warmth of the fire, and the woman beside him and the future they would build together. Outside, winter still gripped the land, but inside Thornfield House, spring had already begun. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Whitmore became Eleanor Rothwell, Duchess of Thornfield, in a ceremony that was simple but deeply felt. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, altered to fit her perfectly. Sebastian wore his formal attire and could barely speak his vows for the emotion choking his throat. The staff wept openly. The tenants cheered. The rector pronounced them man and wife with genuine pleasure. And when Sebastian kissed his bride before the assembled witnesses, he felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and melt away. They held a small reception in the main house afterward, nothing elaborate but warm and filled with genuine celebration. Sebastian stood with Eleanor at his side, accepting congratulations, and felt a peace he had not known in 7 years. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Sebastian and Eleanor stood together in the entrance hall where, just weeks ago, they had confessed their love. "Happy?" Sebastian asked, taking her hand. "Beyond measure," Eleanor said, smiling up at him. "And you?" "Terrified," Sebastian admitted. "Uncertain, still learning. But yes, happy. More happy than I ever believed possible." "Good," Eleanor said firmly, "because this is only the beginning. We have a lifetime ahead of us, Sebastian, a lifetime of learning to love each other better, of making mistakes and forgiving them, of building something neither of us could have built alone." "A daunting prospect," Sebastian said, "but a worthy one," Eleanor countered, "and we shall face it together." Sebastian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Together. It was the most beautiful word he had ever heard. Outside, snow began to fall once more, soft and silent, covering the grounds in fresh white. But inside Thornfield House, warmth blazed in every hearth. Light glowed in every window. Music drifted through the halls. The Duke, who had kept the world at arm's length for 7 years, had finally learned to embrace it. And in doing so, he had found not merely love, but redemption. The wounds of the past would always remain, faint. Scars that marked where he had broken and been made whole again, but they no longer defined him, no longer controlled him. He was Sebastian Rothwell, Duke of Thornfield, husband to Eleanor, and for the first time in 7 years, he was truly, completely alive.